We're now deep in the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno. In fact, we're talking about, we talked last time about Inferno 26, which is the, in which we focused on the classical hero Odysseus, whom Dante calls Ulysses. And now we're going to talk about Canto 27 and a contemporary figure, a contemporary of Dante's, someone who lived in the previous generation, a northern Italian Ghibelline politician, a very skillful man, a very cunning man. He calls himself a fox, and his name is Guido da Montefeltro. Now, before we get to Guido, I want to talk for a moment about Ulysses, because we kind of have to read Ulysses and Guido side by side. And as I mentioned the last time, with Ulysses, it's not obvious what this is the circle of fraud, but what the fraud is. And we discover that the fraud is implicit. Ulysses is not a kind of open fraudster. Well, he was a little more open in the sense that he, when he devised the fraud of the Trojan horse, that was a fraud, but Dante doesn't fault him for that, because that's a military tactic. And what Dante does is fault him for an implicit fraud, namely leading a bunch of old men to their deaths, not for their sake, but for his own sake. Ulysses wants to make one final voyage. He's driven by his restless ambition, and he sacrifices his men and himself, as it turns out, to pursue this kind of knowledge of all human things, including all human vices. And we see here a clue not only to Guido da Montefeltro, because when we find two guys in the same circle, we always need to relate them one to the other. But we also see the temptation here for Dante, because Dante, like Ulysses, is a very capable guy. And Dante, like Ulysses, knows that. And Dante, like Ulysses, knows that he has a power over other people. He has the power of persuasion, of communication. And so the temptation is to misuse that power, to abuse it. And so one of the lessons for Dante in these circles is don't be a fraudster. Recognize that with great talent comes great responsibility. And I think this is why Dante devotes really 2 whole cantos to a single vice, a single sin, the sin of fraud, that we see both in its ancient form, Ulysses, and now in its more contemporary, which is to say 13th century or 14th century form, Guido da Montefeltro. Now, Ulysses and Guido are encased in a flame, so they're kind of tortured by this. They're singed by the flames, and they are writhing in torment or in pain. And yet, Guido kind of comes up to Dante, and he says something very interesting. He says that he wants to tell Dante his story. And he says, if I thought I were speaking to a soul who might someday return to the world, most certainly this flame would cease to flicker. So what Guido's saying is, hey, hey, fellow, I want to tell you my story. Now, listen, if I thought that you were going to take it back to the world, I wouldn't tell you. He goes, continuing Guido, but since no one, if I have heard the truth, ever returns alive from this deep pit with no fear of dishonor, I answer you. So Guido's saying, but since everybody here is dead, obviously no one is going back to Earth. Now, Guido couldn't be more wrong. Dante is in fact going back to Earth, but Guido doesn't know that. So Guido is sort of deceived here by what Dante is doing deep in this circle of hell. And Guido feels comfortable since he thinks that we're sort of among the dead. Let me tell you my story. And then says Guido, he goes, tell me, are the Romagna at war or at peace? He's asking about the people in his own neighborhood, the northern part of Rome, the northern part of Italy. He goes, how are my people doing, basically? And then Dante says, I was bending forward listening when my master, this is Virgil, touched my side and said to me, you speak to him. This one's Italian. So let's back up. Remember that when we were dealing with Ulysses, Dante didn't speak to Ulysses at all. It was Virgil. Virgil and Ulysses, who were sort of contemporaries from the ancient world, they talked. And now Virgil is saying, hey, listen, this is kind of one of your guys. He's Italian, like you. He's from your part of Italy. And you two have this conversation. You go, you talk to him. And Guido now begins to tell a remarkable story, which I'll only begin the first couple of lines, and we'll pick it up tomorrow. Here's Guido. I was a man of arms, a warrior, and then a friar. So here's a guy who started out as a warrior and then became a monk, became a friar. Believing with the cord to make amends. Believing with the cord is the rope that the friars tie around their robe to make amends. In other words, he goes, at some point in life, I realized I needed to make some penance for the crimes and sins of my earlier life. So I thought, let me do that by becoming a friar. And he goes, and surely my belief would have come true, meaning he would have been able to make amends and he would find himself, he thinks, in heaven. Quote, were it not for that high priest, his soul be damned, who put me back among my early sins, I want to tell you why and how it happened. So basically Guido's saying, I almost made it to heaven. I was kind of getting there when this damnable high priest, who's he talking about? The Pope, Boniface VIII. In fact, I skipped over it, but Boniface is in Canto 19, among people who have corrupted and sold church offices. In other words, a corrupt cleric. Dante has no patience for this. And I could do a whole talk on Boniface, but here I just want to say that this guy Guido says that Boniface, the Pope, led him into further sins even after he became a friar. And so again, let's remember, we're getting these stories always from the point of view of the sinner. And notice that Dante doesn't dispute with them or argue with them. The sinner is able to sort of spin the story. And Guido, as we'll see, is a major spinmeister, a major spin doctor. And just as Francesca said, love made me do it, and the book made me do it. And just as Pierre de la Vigne said, envy made me do it. Here we have Guido saying, the Pope made me do it.